My wife and I were out here this afternoon having lunch on the porch like we usually do when the weather's nice. And out of the corner of my eye, I caught a view of a grapevine climbing up one of the banisters on the other side. And for a second, I thought it was a snake. And it instinctively took me back to about 1977, 1978, in a memory that the only reason I feel I have retained this memory is because it was so strange. This is one of the strangest stories you will ever hear. It's absolutely true, and it's absolutely creepy. So I would have been about 4 years old, and we were visiting my father's parents in very rural West by God, Virginia. As I explained to my wife, this was a place, there was an old farmhouse they lived in, but only one story, probably older than ours, and our house was built in 1903. They had hundreds of acres in the middle of nowhere. Their driveway was a long dirt driveway off from a long dirt road. The closest paved road was probably 5 miles away, as was probably the closest neighbor. It's about as remote as you can get. So there was a porch swing on one end of the porch, and I had a cousin who was in his 20s at the time, sitting there on the porch swing, just swaying back and forth, chewing tobacco, spitting in the yard, not saying anything at all. He didn't say a word the whole time we were there. Very quiet. My father was the youngest of 14 siblings, and this is why there was such an age difference between myself and my cousin on the porch swing. My father was young enough to have been most of his siblings' child. He was an afterthought baby, a surprise baby. His father, I believe, was 50 when he was born. His mother was 42, and this would have been back in the 1940s when these things were even more rare. So my older cousin's on the porch swing, swaying back and forth, spitting his tobacco out in the yard. My father and I are sitting there on the glider. I'm about 4 years old. My feet can't even touch the ground. And the porch was one that was made out of lumber, old B or C boards from a local mill, no doubt. And there were considerable sized cracks in between each plank. So we're going back and forth on the glider. And my dad says, when I was about your age, I was sitting out here on the glider like this with my dad, and one of my older cousins or relatives was sitting there on the porch swing, just like he is right there, just chewing tobacco, spitting tobacco, and this 6 foot long black racer just comes up through the cracks of the porch, and my cousin, or whatever relation he was to me, just jumped up and stomped on that snake's head just as quick as he could, and held it up, and he held it up at his head level, and the man was 6 feet tall, and its crushed head was still touching the floor. And as my dad said that, a freaking black snake, black racer, comes up through the cracks on the porch, and my cousin, who was so much older than me, without saying a word, jumps off of the porch swing and stomps on that thing with his big black boot, like a work boot, crushes its head. So everybody that had been in the house who heard the stomp came out to see what was going on, and here was my older cousin, about 6 feet tall, holding his snake up by the tail, and it was level with its head. And everybody was in awe about how big the snake was, but I was in awe, and I can remember this like it was yesterday, and this would have been 44 years ago. I was in awe because that happened just as my father was telling that story. So everybody had come out of the house to see the snake, had gone back in the house. So my cousin walks out across the lawn just like this, down to the far edge of the field there, and he throws this snake over into the weeds. Comes back, sits down, again, never having said a word, sits there in his swing, starts swinging back and forth, spitting tobacco juice out in the yard there. And my dad said, wasn't that strange? That was just so strange. That happened just like it did, X amount of years ago, a generation before, just as I told that story. And I said, yeah, that was strange. Of course, my cousin's sitting there rocking on the swing, never said a word. And my dad says, you know what? There's only one more thing that could happen to make this story even more strange than that already is. And I said, well, what's that? And he says, after that happened, and whatever the relationship was, stomped its head, and everybody had come out and looked at it, and he carried it off and threw it over in the weeds. We got set back down, got settled back in, and I'll be dogged on if another one just as big as that one didn't come up out of the cracks of the porch, and my cousin or whoever he was jumped off the porch swing and stomped that sucker on the head again. And just as he finished those words, another 5 to 6 foot long black racer came up out of the cracks from that porch, and my cousin, who I'd never heard the man speak the whole day, came over, stomped it with his big black work boot. Everybody comes out of the house again to see this snake, head crushed. He's holding it up by the tail. It's touching the ground. The man was 6 feet tall. When they've gone back inside, he walked over the edge of the field, tossed it over in the weeds, came back down, and sat there and just kept chewing his tobacco and spitting out in the yard. Nobody else said a word the rest of the time we sat on that porch. True story, strange story that just came flashing back to my memory here when I saw that grapevine up there that for a minute I thought was a snake. Folks, there are just simply things in this world that can't be explained, and that story's one of them.